this home where 20 years ago we got our start. So we will begin tonight with an opening prayer by our host, Monsignor David Sword, and then I will ask, since each of these panelists were there for the first one 20 years ago, I'll ask them each to make some brief remarks looking back. Monsignor Sword, please.
Heavenly Father, as we commemorate 20 years of Dawn Unity, we give you thanks for bringing us together, for helping us see one another's perspectives, to focus also particularly what unites us in a country that is so divided today. Continue to be with us, and may we always listen to one another as we share our own perspectives in our various faith traditions. But what unites us all is that you are the one God who created us and brought us together, Lord, forever and ever. Amen. Well, my first reflection on this is it's not exactly the same crowd we had 20 years ago. It was, 20 years ago, there were probably over 500 people in this place. We had to open up all the doors for all the chairs we could find. And it was a larger panel as well. But what's interesting about this particular panel is this was the original panel 20 years ago. And I felt blessed to have developed a friendship and a relationship with them. Each of them enriched me so much in what they had to offer. And Ron, it's so great to see you back. It's been a long time. So it was, I realized that you went east and now you've come back to California where you belong. You know, I think what brought the first one so much attention was it was right after 9/11. And we did have an imam who was on our panel, and I think in the midst of all of that, the fact that these different faith perspectives could share their ideas, not as debating, not as fighting, but to understand one another. And I felt it was such a blessing, and I felt personally very privileged to be part of Dawn Unity over these past 20 years.
I want to echo everything that David, Monsignor Sword, just said. Being here feels like 20 years ago. None of us have changed. But a lot has also happened. 20 years ago, doing interfaith conversation was still kind of a new and slightly revolutionary thing. In the last 20 years, it has become commonplace, but I think there are very few groups in the country, I would assume, who have kept up every year for 2 decades to have 4 sessions every year. And I want to give thanks to our chair, Bob Rothman, who really made this happen. He is the driving force, prompting us, prodding us at times, cajoling, begging, but it's wonderful to be back with, as David said, people who 20 years ago were strangers but have now become good friends, brothers. I wish we had some sisters as well, but we're working.
Good evening, good evening. It is just such a moving experience to be back thinking 20 years ago and to see all of you and to reunite with so many of you. I'm really privileged and honored to have been invited back to this moment. And I echo everything that's been said in terms of our relationships. You maybe only see us now and again when we come in public, but we actually know each other and share much together and have become genuine friends through the years. We rooted for the Dodgers this evening and long distance. Reinhard has actually been with me in my community in La Jolla, where we've tried to teach folks about interfaith experience together. So really, really, it's a delight. Bob, in your honor, I brought the Peninsula News article from November 10th of 2001 that shows us here. Here we are, I'll pass this around. Here we are on the stage here. Jonathan, that looks like you. And there's the crowd, and it was titled, "A Spirited Seminar Shared 6 Views of Faith." And my reflection on this is that that's what's unique. Groups meet, groups talk, different backgrounds, different faiths, different kinds of heritage share, but we go deep. We go into theology, we go into text, we challenge each other, we grow with each other, and that's, I think, what's been precious about Dawn. Now, I was only here for the first few years, but that's what I've seen and heard as I've stayed in touch, and I think that's a tribute not only to Bob, but a tribute to the community who have sustained this and maintained this and showed interest in this. So my statement is one of thanksgiving to everybody, and to my friends in the audience who know this blessing, I invite you to join with me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'hikiyanu lazman hazeh. Blessed is God, the sovereign of the universe, for the gift of our lives and for enabling us to come to this precious moment 20 years after we began Dawn Unity.
Well, it really does seem impossible to believe that it was 20 years ago that we were together on this panel. And with the commemorations of 9/11 that unfolded in the last month, it sort of reminded me of the deep, and I would even say desperate, hunger that there was present in the community for some handle to hold on to, some way of understanding the tumult, the chaos, the seeming abyss into which we had been catapulted by the attacks on that day. And I think of it as something that impacted our lives in obvious ways. Years of war, conflict, division. But I think I even would say that it affected me in day-to-day ways that I still think it ought not have. And what I mean by that is an event of that scope and significance, sort of, you would think it would dwarf many of our day-to-day issues, troubles, car that doesn't start, the child's lunch that isn't packed and ready for school, those kinds of things. And I found in the weeks, months after 9/11, maybe even within a couple of years of that time, that I was actually more easily aggrieved by small things than I had been before. And I believe that my capacity for chaos was so fully occupied by the distress of that loss that day and the unfolding chaos that came after it, that I just felt, I think, spiritually depleted in ways that, you might think, well, a big thing like that would make other aggravations seem smaller. In fact, small aggravations seemed bigger to me. And so when I think back to 20 years ago and the group that was gathered here, it really was, for me, a very special moment of connection, of mutuality, of collegiality, of trust and regard among a variety of different perspectives at a time that I felt was deeply and desperately needed. And so for that I give thanks again and again.
Well, I have to say that I do not attribute my gray hair to the 20 years of Dawn. It came from elsewhere. But I do need to say two things in all humility. I am the best moderator this group has ever had. And I have found out the only person who comes because of me is my wife Celia. So modesty is the name of the game. And I'm so glad you're all here, and let's get started. I would like to announce that since we're talking about Genesis, a biblical subject, I tried to have a Muslim present. Professor Amir Hussein was supposed to be on the panel, and he developed a conflict. I also asked Ashraf Kareem, and he has a religious conflict tonight, so neither of them could come. Ashraf was on the first panel, which I thought would be interesting. So we're without a Muslim spokesman tonight, but we'll give it a go. Seems absolutely necessary to start with Abraham. I think Abraham is given so much credit, and yet there's another side, and this is where I want to start. Abraham we commend because his faith was so strong. He followed the command of God to go forth from his home in Ur to Canaan, and he did. He also followed the same instructions, similar instructions from God to go forth and sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Did these things in complete faith. But we also read that Abraham told the Pharaoh of Egypt that his beautiful wife Sarah was his sister. And Pharaoh married Sarah. And Abraham made no effort to protect his wife. Abraham also told Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, that his beautiful wife Sarah was his sister, and Abimelech took her, and until he discovered the truth. So I want to start by asking the panel how to weigh these two sides of Abraham, or how do you approach the text in both? And I'm going to open it to whoever wants to jump in. Or all, it sounds like.
I won't make a definitive statement on all of that, but I will say that a story like that complicates and nuances when we are having debates and discussions about other topics. When someone says, I believe in the biblical view of marriage. And I think, which biblical view of marriage? The one where you present your wife as your sister in order to save your life and allow her to be married off twice to different powerful potentates. That's part of the biblical record, but it's not something I commend to you or anyone. Let's understand that. But I think I find it encouraging and hopeful that stories of such chaos and distress should have made the cut when people were deciding what was scripture and what was not. A more aggressive editorial team could have taken that story and others out and made for a text that had fewer seams and fewer edges and been much easier to understand and appropriate, and would have been far poorer, much less rich with material that continues to provoke and prod us in the millennia since.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and I would share that perspective. I find this story extraordinarily interesting and highly ironic. As Bob quoted or told the story, Abraham says to Sarah, "Please say that you are my sister so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may remain alive thanks to you. And he says, if the Egyptians see you and think she's my wife, they will kill me and let you live. So this is the setup to the story, and Sarah is taken into the Pharaoh's court, and somehow things don't go well, and the Pharaoh notices there is something that is not right, and so he summons Abraham, and this is what he says to Abraham. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues on account of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Pharaoh sent for Abraham and said, "What is it that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife, take her and be gone." And Pharaoh put men in charge of him, and they sent him off with his wife and all that he possessed. What is extraordinary to me is Abraham's prejudice about the Pharaoh is absolutely misplaced. Pharaoh actually lectures the father of faith, the patriarch, on morality, that he should not have lied. And so there is a very subversive strain that the God whom Abraham serves, whom he obeyed in leaving his family, his native land, goes to Egypt, which in the Jewish tradition is really the bad place, the place of oppression, of slavery. Here's the Pharaoh acting, so to speak, as the spokesperson, instructing Abraham, one would say later, on Jewish morality. To me, it's a very ironic, almost even humorous way the story is told. And the question of what do we learn from this, I wonder whether we could have just a show of hands, who has a perfect family? So Abraham did it.
There is a follow-on issue too.
Wait.
Please.
So ditto to all of that, but I want to take this to a little different place when we think about Abraham. So Bob, you started the question by pointing out that God tells Abraham, "Lech lecha, go forward to the land that I will show you, leave your father's house," and all this familiar. I want to suggest that that's a misreading of the story. And I'm going back just a few verses before. So we learn here who Avram is. We learn who Abraham is. I'm in Genesis chapter 11. We learn about Terach, who lived 70 years, and he begot 3 sons, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So now I know who his father is, and I know who his brothers are. And then it tells me this is the line of Terach. Terach begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. Those of you who know the story know that Abram has to become responsible for his nephew Lot. Now I know who Lot belongs to. Unfortunately, I learned Haran died in the lifetime of his father. Now I know why Abraham has to take care of Lot, because he lost his father in the native land of Ur. Abraham and Nahor took themselves wives, the name of Avram's wife being Sarai, so that's where we first meet her, and that of Nahor's wife being Milcah. It turns out, however, that Milcah is the daughter of Haran. So he married his niece. Okay. And Milcah had a sister named Iscah. We don't know who Iscah is. The Jewish tradition of interpretation says that's actually Sarah. So did Abraham marry Sarah just as a nice girl in the neighborhood? Did he marry another member of the family? And when he goes to the Pharaoh to protect his life and seek his livelihood, and he offers her to Pharaoh and says, "Don't tell him that you're my wife," this is complicated. It's not clear what the family line is here, which is not to justify what he does. It's actually to paint a different picture. And let me just take this one step further, and then I'll paint the picture. So now Terach takes his son Avram, his grandson Lot, his daughter-in-law Sarai, and they set out together from Ur to the land of Canaan. So Abraham knows exactly where he's going. It actually isn't his idea. It's his father's idea to take him on this journey. And then we finally get to the famous verse, and God said to Avram, "Lech lecha, go forward, go from everything you're familiar to a land that I will show you." Abraham already knows where he's going. He already knows his father started this migration. So the deeper question is, from what is Abraham separating himself toward what is he going, and what is he going to have to learn along the road that is going to give him this ability to trust in the monotheism that is this new vision? So given the ancient context of these stories and the Mesopotamian culture that this is reflecting at some level, while I don't in any way excuse what Abraham did, and I agree that we're learning a morality play from the other side, we're also watching Abraham develop his character. And we're watching Abraham discover, this I can go, no, that's too far, this is what it will mean to believe in this God is going to bring me a message through various sources, this God is going to hold me accountable. It's not so clear to me that this is just an isolated bad moment, it's more clear to me that this is part of the sweep of the narrative that Genesis is telling, which shows us how Abraham develops to be ultimately the character whom God has chosen to carry this monotheism forward.
I'd just like to throw another thing into the pot, and that is when it was written and why. Because, Abraham is we're talking about 1800 BC. But when we're actually talking about these events, much, much later. More than a millennium later, and a lot of things have happened during that time, and sometimes you try to look at what they're trying to tell us now in light of, for example, the Babylonian captivity. And that goes into the picture when we try to understand what this narrative is about.
Yeah, I would very much agree. I would also like to take up what you just said, Ron.
Take up what David just said.
No. With David, I fully agree. But the question is why Abraham seems to be obviously flawed in some respects. He does not argue with Pharaoh, but yeah, she is really my niece, and so he accepts the charge that he lied to Pharaoh. But to me, that raises the question: Abraham, as a biblical figure, as a patriarch, is portrayed as having at times unconditional faith, and at times like this, he looks very, very fallible. And so to me, the question is, what is the message, including the message to the first hearers, the Babylonian, the Jews in the exile of Babylon? And to me, it seems to say, God expects faith from us, but God does also not abandon us when we fall, and at times fall badly. I don't know whether you would agree.
Of course I'll agree, right? So we're actually raising a number of really, really interesting to me aspects about what Scripture is to begin with. These stories, from at least my point of view, and I think we all share this, are redacted through different lenses. There are at least 3 redactions historically that we know about, the exilic community in Babylonia being the second, because we know there's an earlier redacting of these stories from their earliest Mesopotamian roots, and then there's a third. It depends who's reading the text. As Karen Armstrong likes to teach, and I think her insights onto the text are really important, the Scripture is a living, dynamic body that is always being read and recreated by the generation and what it needs. I don't know what the first redactors of these Abraham stories were trying to say. I don't know who their audience was. They never imagined you and I would be sitting here today and reading these stories. Right? So there's something paradigmatic about Abraham as a character. Probably wasn't one individual, probably is a composite of all sorts of stories that are brought together about a patriarch, about a tribal leader, about somebody with a different vision or mission or destiny. And the flaw aspect in his character is why we can relate to him. At least I think, certainly from the lens of the Jewish tradition, it's the flaws in these characters that make them actually role models for us. because it's in those flaws that we learn something of human, like you just said, failing. And when I want to read the text not at a historic level or at a literary level, but at a religious level, when I want to derive faith from it, I need to see a role model who I can actually relate to, who I can connect to. Right? And the last thing I'll say, and then please let's continue the conversation, is one of the things I always tell people when we read these stories is leave it in the text. Don't try this at home. By which I mean, internally the text has a reason for this narrative. And I'm doing my best to try to understand it. But I may not get there. Leave it in the text.
Let me offer an explanation of something I read one time that really piqued my thoughts. Why are the founding patriarchs and matriarchs presented with their flaws in addition to their piety, right alongside each other? And the question always, just saying they're real people never sat well with me. Well, last year I read a book, and in it there was an explanation that is really fascinating. I'm going to share it with you. You have to accept two facts. Number one is that the stories in Genesis may have existed for whatever length of time, but Genesis was put together or redacted, as the biblical scholars say, in Babylonia after the exile. And number two, Jews have, throughout their history, always said, observant Jews, if something bad happened to us, we deserved it. God is punishing us. And this is something that's ingrained in Jewish history. So if you put these two things together, you can speculate that the reason the flaws are included is that the people who redacted these stories wanted to show that with all the flaws of the founding patriarchs and matriarchs, the great punishment of the 400 years of slavery occurred because they deserved it. But then God redeemed them and brought them out of Egypt because He was redeeming them. And if you take this to Babylonia, this terrible thing, the temple was destroyed, the exile has occurred, God is punishing us. But look back, we've been punished before as a people, and we were redeemed, so there's hope for the future. Now, I think that's an interesting take, and let me open the floor for that.
So let me just jump in for a minute on that. So yes, but, because we're missing the more important redaction for Genesis. If you ask why do Adam and Eve have to leave the garden, if you ask why does Abraham have to leave home, if you ask why ultimately in the story of Moses does Moses have to bring the bones of Joseph back, those are all stories of the exile. If you ask why is Abraham a flawed character, you have to go look at King David. Because the stories of Genesis that we're talking about are redacted also as a reflection of the Davidic dynasty and the role that becomes, and there is a very powerful biblical theory out there that says the original book of the 5 books is this document known as J, which begins with creation and ends with David coming to the throne. And the stories of David and his flaws, and yet biblically he's seen to be a hero for a whole variety of reasons, are now mirrored in Abraham. Yes, you see, you can be flawed and still be a leader. You can make mistakes or be corrected by God and still lead the people. You can unify a people even though you yourself aren't perfect. And you can't leave that piece of the redaction history out of the Abraham stories.
It fits. I agree. I'm reaching for the mic.
So, yes, they're stories of flawed human beings, and they have been gathered and edited, revised, brought together by people who were reckoning with circumstances of their day in a way not unlike we have been reckoning with the circumstances of our recent time. And so stories that had once made sense to them in one light now made more sense in a different way. And so it's not that they were true or false, but that values that had maybe not seemed important in an earlier time now emerged as increasingly important. And I would say that this interpretation through the story of King David is one of the key themes, threads, interpretive lenses for that. And I think another is the simple survival of the Jewish community and its ancestors in really remarkably unlikely odds. If we were placing bets on who was going to make it, who was going to come out of some of those different ancient times, wise people among us would have put our chips down on the Egyptians. They had the Nile going for them, a source of annual renewal of life, of crops, of sustenance for a large gathering of priestly structure, of massive army, and in times of drought and desolation, people from all around that part of the world came to Egypt because there was food there. We would have been well to put our money down on Egypt. Others would have said, no, I think the Mesopotamians, the breadbasket of the ancient world, the Tigris and the Euphrates coming together, ancient Babylon and the resources that were present there. Those were the people that had something really going for them. And others would have said, no, the Assyrians, they had built an empire. They had a powerful army. They would be the ones who would emerge from that time as the dominant force of that world. And in truth, each of those empires came and went, and others like them did as well. And in a way, despite all of the odds, every possible circumstance, condition, situation that would have gone against them, out of that emerges this really relatively small land poor, resource poor, underdog community held together despite all of that. And you can see that same thread woven through the stories of the Genesis characters as, over and over again, the underdog triumphs. I'm a firstborn. The stories of Genesis do not favor firstborns. The world tends to favor firstborns. The stories of Genesis favor secondborns. It is they who, again, when the odds of the culture were stacked against them, used their creativity, wiles, dishonesty, scheming, energy, initiative to pull out of an entirely unlikely situation their not only survival but their triumph. And over and over again, to me, I see this is the story of Israel in each generation, of the blessing of God falling upon the least likely character in the story. And that for ancient Hebrews and early Jews to see themselves as the survivors of that was, I think, a wonderful gift and a strength of the text.
I'd like to speak from a Christian's perspective of all of this, and that is the Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy. And the genealogy did not begin with Adam, as Luke's does. It begins with Abraham and ends with Christ. But it's a very artificial genealogy. It's 42 generations, and if you take your numbers, 14 times 3, 3 being a magical number, and 14 takes the letters of David. And so the Messiah is supposed to be the epitome of David. However, when we look at David, even though he was the greatest of kings of Israel, that was when the kingdom was united until after the death of his son, he wasn't an ideal role model. I mean, he started out fairly good, but then he got corrupted, and toward the end it was not such a good thing. Yet at the same time, he is proclaimed as kind of, when we look at Jesus and Messiah, as the new David. And we begin with Abraham. So even with this we're seeing, and when you look at even the figures that are listed in the genealogy, they weren't the most outstanding figures. In fact, they weren't all of the descendants of Abraham. You get somebody like Ruth, who was a Moabite, who's mentioned that. So even when we look at this, there's a certain flaw in all of these things, even as we look at that genealogy that Matthew presents.
Yeah, maybe if I could pick up on that, the Christian perspective. Jonathan said the Jewish people throughout history have reinterpreted, seen Abraham through different historical contextual lenses. In some sense, one could argue that Christianity has done the same thing. Paul looks at Abraham and reads Abraham, the Genesis story, very selectively. Paul says Abraham had faith and never doubted. That's not quite the record that is in the Genesis story. Abraham doubted very much. At one point when God tells him that he shall have another son, he falls down laughing. He says, "You've got to be kidding me." And he argues with God. But Christianity, one could argue, has also what I would like to call dancing with the text. And one might even include Islam. I wish that Amir Hussein was here. They also, the Muslim tradition picks up Abraham in the Quran and reads and works with this character, and to say, what is this character, what does the story have to say to us in a new context? First, for the early Christians, in the context of the Roman Empire being a persecuted minority, and what is our relationship to the people of whom Jesus was born, namely the Jewish people, how are we related? And they look to Abraham. And in a similar way, Muslims look to Abraham to look at their identity within the early community in Mecca. And so one could argue that these stories that have been written down after a long oral tradition in Genesis continue to affect us, to form us. I mean, this is the reason why we're here, right? These ancient stories. And Ron, you were saying you have no idea what the text meant to the first readers. No. But somehow we can't leave the story in the text. You say, what does it mean for us? It may mean something completely different, or something somewhat different, something partially different from what readers over several generations have taken out of it and applied to their own lives. This mysterious interweaving with ordinary life of ordinary people, that God somehow is working and interwoven in this. So in some ways, these stories are our family album, with role models, with crazy uncles, with all the rest. And so to me, that is very inspirational, that the characters, at least as they're portrayed in Genesis, are not all perfect. That gives me some hope that my imperfect family maybe also is not completely off the track or will not be abandoned by God.
let's be fair, and it's time to hit on the women a little bit here. I can't give it all to Abraham and the guys. Sarah tells Abraham to consort with her slave, Egyptian slave Hagar, which produces Ishmael. And later, Sarah tells, with God's approval or God's direction, tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Send them into the desert, send them away from the camp, because Isaac should be the only one. This is pretty hard stuff. Shakespearean, I suppose you could say, some of it. But what do we want to take from that story?
Sarah wants desperately to be able to fulfill the covenant God has promised and deliver to Abraham a child. She sees in her inability to conceive that perhaps the woman Hagar, that can be translated from the Hebrew name Hagar to mean the stranger with me. It could also mean the one who lives among us. Depends how you treat the woman, depends how you look at the woman. So Sarah sees her first as someone who could perhaps ibaneh. She says, ibaneh mimena, I will be built up through her, I will have a son through her. This sense of her being a surrogate for me will fulfill the covenant with Abraham. Of course, it goes woefully wrong, and she becomes very jealous and angry when she sees how easily Hagar conceives. And she wants Hagar gone. And interestingly, here, where we talked about Abraham giving up on Sarah to the Pharaoh, in this story, Abraham is not happy at all with Sarah. And in fact, kind of turns to God and says, get me out of this, help me here. Okay, and ultimately, to me, the most telling piece is how Abraham ultimately responds to this. So Hagar leaves, Sarah banishes her, God sends her back. God sends her back with an instruction that we would never accept today. He sends her back and he says, submit to your mistress's anger toward you. I would never tell that to somebody who felt they were in an abusive relationship and uncomfortable, but that's the text there. So she comes back. In Jewish tradition, the musings and the worrying about this is the belief that actually it's important to Hagar that Ishmael grow up in Abraham's presence. When you get then forward, Bob, to the point that Abraham hears from God, as you said, he laughs, hears from God that he and Sarah at 190 years are going to have a son. In the text, God looks right at Abraham and says, only if you take care of Ishmael. So Abraham says, you want me and Sarah to have a child through whom this covenant will flow? Okay, only if you can promise that my firstborn son, Ishmael, is going to live and be blessed and be well. Sarah, fascinatingly, I think, to those who are telling this tale, never appears in the story or the narrative of her family again until her funeral. Sarah protests. She banishes Hagar and Ishmael. Abraham does what he can to clean that up, to take care of Ishmael. And Sarah is no more a character in the story, including at the most crucial moment, which becomes before her death, the story where God tells Abraham to take Isaac, and the famous story about the binding of Isaac. Sarah's nowhere to be found in this. So again, I think, Bob, what's happening in the text is this dynamic of relationship, parenting, jealousy, rivalry, anger, all of these very real things that we feel, and we're looking at these characters for insight into how we might respond. And the way I often say it is you can protest like Sarah. It might be more effective to protect like Abraham.
Well, let's move down one generation on the subject. Rebecca. And Rebecca conspires with uh, Esau, against Esau, to give the blessing to Jacob. So there you have another matriarch who is getting involved in twisting things. It seems to be a thing to do at this point after Sarah and Rebecca have done this.
I think we also need to make a clarifying comment. We are all men up here. We have no business to talk competently about what women do and think and should be doing and how the characters are portrayed. That being said, I'm not going to mansplain it. I find it at times refreshingly critical what the text does as a subtext. It's a thoroughly patriarchal society and context in which we find ourselves. The women are defined as their function in the main part is to produce a male heir for the patriarch. That is, it doesn't get more patriarchal than that. The woman who is the slave in Abraham's household, Sarah's slave, Hagar, she is not being asked for her consent to this whole arrangement. We have very clear language for that when a woman is not asked for consent for sexual relations now. At the same time that the text is so thoroughly patriarchal, Abraham at times, the patriarch, appears to be oddly weak. He takes his marching orders often from Sarah, saying, "You sleep with your slave." And he said, "Well, okay, if that's what you think." And he doesn't act at times like a patriarch. And what is also interesting in the story, when he sends Hagar away and she is near dying, she has an epiphany, a revelation from God. And this is what the angel of God says to this, I would say, abused woman slave. And the angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly increase your offspring, and they shall be too many to count." This rings very familiar in the Genesis story because it is on par, it is on parallel what God has told Abraham. So this abused woman slave receives a revelation that is on par with the patriarch. To me, that is a very subversive feminist trait in this thoroughly patriarchal story. Sarah is never addressed like that in any way. So there's also undercurrents that I find fascinating and to be discovered, and especially for our time. And I'm amazed, as Ron earlier said, or was it Jonathan, that this was not edited out. Also the story, the whole story, if you look at how the story continues, that the line continues through Isaac according to the Jewish tradition, that the story about Ishmael and the conflict is not edited out. It is left in the tension that it is for us to wrestle with, to respond with, not simply to emulate, but to say what is the lesson that we can learn from this.
The other dynamic in all this is trying to explain why there is so much conflict among the peoples of that area who are, in a sense, relatives. That's repeated again and again. And I think that's also another area, when they're talking about it later on, looking at the story, why is it that we have so much conflict, and that we can say that even till today, that is going on. And so I think part of this whole story is trying to explain, well, it began from the very beginning, and it is not just the issue of Ishmael. It occurred when they talked earlier about Cain and what happened there. So it is something that's kind of a theme that kind of, to me, is carried throughout, and it's a reflection of the turmoil that exists among the peoples.
Bob, you were, I think, starting to point us to Rebecca and the Jacob-Esau stories. And there is a way of reading the text that says Rebecca was scheming, she was intervening, she was messing around with how things were supposed to be. Her two sons, twins, one born before the other, that makes him the firstborn, should have been privileged, should have received the blessing, should have received the favor of his father, should have received a greater portion of the inheritance, and she works to undermine that. And that's true. However, at the time that she conceives the children and has within her womb evidence of a wrestling match that has already begun between these two twins, consults God, who says, 2 nations are at war within your womb, and this is how it's going to be, and the younger one is going to supplant the older one. The smaller one is going to supplant the bigger one. And it would be, I think, a fair reading of the text to say, she is simply trying to live out the vision that God gave her, trying to make peace with what was happening in her own body. She feels like she's been giving marching orders by the God who created her and all things. Who is she to get in the way of the plan as it was laid out to her in that revelation? So I once heard, just I think the most terribly misogynistic sermon ever, that it was a Mother's Day sermon, so that made it even better, comparing the faithfulness, the humility, the piety of the mother of Moses, who was, according to the preacher, a woman of no great physical appearance, just a very humble servant of God, versus Rebecca, who is painted by many of the Renaissance and later painters as this gorgeous, beautiful, long, flowing hair, scheming manipulator who fails to honor God and who messes up her family. And I thought, she just did the same thing that Moses' mother did. She tried to be faithful within the terms that had been given to her. And why is it Rebecca's fault if people 2,000 years after she might have lived painted her with long flowing hair?
So Jonathan, I think that's right on point. Personally, Rebecca's my favorite of the matriarchs. And in terms of Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. And no, I can't speak and look through it through the lens like a woman could. But if I look at what she's doing, she's been raised in an environment of deceit. Laban and Jacob and all that goes on. She knows her 2 sons. And I don't think she's being deceitful. I think she's being a decision maker. Which son is the proper son for this, and which son is the proper son for that? Because the modeling is that God will take care of both sons. That's what we just saw with Isaac and Ishmael. So which son is the proper one for this role? Which son is the proper one for that? Well, of course, the lens of the Torah is now going to focus on Jacob and not Esau. Right? But I think Rebecca's actually active and thoughtful. And to your point, Jonathan, she knows what God told her. So she knows that this outcome is not a matter of deceit, but rather a matter of, I've been given an assignment, I better carry it through.
The text even sets things up because it describes Esau as a hunter, as a very furry kind. You think of him as an animal and with tendencies, and not so with Jacob. Jacob is a shepherd, and Jacob is smooth-skinned, and it seems to be the Michelangelo model, if you would, or something like that.
Yeah, my book doesn't come with pictures. I don't know what they look like.
Describe.
You got to
to read between the lines, that's your problem. Let me take a little different approach. Let's talk about lines of succession of the religion. We start with Abraham, and then Ishmael is pushed out of the succession. Isaac is the successor. Well, after Sarah dies, Abraham marries Keturah and has 6 or 7 sons. They're not part of the story. It's all focused on Isaac. When you think that 6 or 7 sons living in Abraham's tent would have shared his belief in God, would have shared some of his faithfulness. Anyway, so Isaac now is the carrier of the name. And then you have Jacob and Esau, and Jacob, one guy, becomes the carrier. And these guys have their flaws, and they fight. Then you get into Jacob's family. He's got 12 sons. And they're all dirty, almost all of them. They threaten to kill their brother. They sell their brother into slavery. And these are the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the ones who became Israel. It is, I just don't understand it. Rabbi, straighten me out.
Oh boy, calling on me, okay. So actually it's fascinating, Bob, because the question actually brings together a lot of the themes that we've been talking about here. So let's go back for a moment to the vision that Rebecca receives when the twins are fighting within her. Okay, that's now starting the transition to the cycle of Genesis at another level when we talk about what Genesis is. Genesis is the book of the history of the Jewish people who now have to get to Egypt. The whole point of Genesis is to get the story into Egypt and to get the descendants of Jacob's family into Egypt to be able to tell the larger redemptive story, which is what the rest of the Bible is about. Once you get past Genesis, the Bible is about God's redeeming of life and of the people and of the future. So Genesis is all about setting that up. So here we know, and Jonathan, you alluded to this very beautifully earlier, here we know that the text is the younger will serve the older. Here we know up front that the smaller people, the weaker people, the people you said earlier that you wouldn't bet on to make it through, in this case for Genesis, the descendants of Jacob, the forerunners of the Jewish people, they're ultimately being told, you're going to come out okay. You're going to come out on top. So no, it's not Ishmael, it's Isaac. No, it's not Esau, it's Jacob. No, it's not Reuven or any of the other sons. It's actually the sons of Joseph. And when Joseph goes to bless his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, he goes to bless the older one before the younger one. And actually his father, Jacob, looks at Joseph and says, Joseph is going to bring them to his father. But Jacob says, that's not how we do it in our family. Actually, I have to bless the younger one first. So there's a very clear statement being made here that you who feel smaller, you who feel put upon, you who feel outcast, you who feel unable, you're actually being set up for redemption. You're actually being set up to be viable, to succeed, to go forward. And that's totally what the story is about here. Is there rivalry? Are there tribes? Are there conflicts? Well, of course, but now you have to go back again to the historical pieces. When is all that being put together in terms of the redacted text that we have? But from a religious perspective, the message of the text is, you little one, hang tight. The redemption is coming. You will come through.
And then in the Christian scriptures, this is the question Paul wrestles with, to say, is God unjust? Is God arbitrary? And his whole argument leads him to this, but he says this is not possible. But in some sense, it continues with the story of Jesus, who says, the first shall be last, and the last will be first. So he was a good Jewish rabbi, in my opinion, continuing this line that this God has very subversive tendencies. This God is not a supporter of the status quo, of the powerful, suppressing the weak, but God is a God of the underdog. And it continues in both the Jewish and the Christian scriptures as a thread that goes through again and again, to everybody's surprise, and against the cultural norms in which these people live.
And just back to the beginning where we all were, remember the promise to Abraham is your descendants are going to end up being enslaved in Egypt. You know from the very beginning, Abraham, that there's an arc to this story, which then plays out in your tradition as you described, plays out in our tradition, but it's set up from the very front. Genesis knows it's a setup for what's coming.
We haven't hit on Jacob yet. There's plenty there. I think Jacob is the most, well, let me politely say different from the others in terms of his faith. Jacob is the only one who actually negotiates with God, and to the point of view, chutzpah is the word for it. Jacob says in Genesis 28, 20 and 21, he makes a deal. If God remains with me, if he protects me on the journey that I am making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. And of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. So here's Jacob saying, if you take care of me, I'll be nice to you. I'll worship you. I'll be your God. But it's so conditional, and none of the other patriarchs have any hint of conditionalism like that. Why Jacob? What's going on here?
But that's the same story of many Psalms. To say, if you rescue me, God, I'm in the dumps. If you rescue me, I shall worship and praise you in the assembly of your people. In some sense, it's common sense to say, if I perish, if you let me perish, God, you have no one to praise you, right?
Well, it's very pessimistic, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's pessimistic, but it's also sort of common sense to say, God, help me out here, rescue me, and if I come through this, you have my undying loyalty, right?
If you let me hit the home run, I will worship you. That's what he's saying. It's not the way you approach worship.
Yeah, but if I perish on the way, you have no worshiper left. So God, it's not in your own interest to let me perish you.
How many times have any of us had somebody come to us and say, I'll speak for myself, if I get through this illness, I'm coming to synagogue more often. If I overcome this, I'm going to become a better practicing Jew, or whatever it is. Right? Some conditional statement which I have to smile and embrace and support, and then say, yeah, but that's not really what's at play here. Right? So let's get talking about really what's at play emotionally and spiritually for you. Okay? Bob, I think we have to ask a little bit about who Jacob is. Just look at the narrative. Okay? His father had a heck of a traumatic experience. Okay, he almost lost his life at his grandfather's, hand with a knife. You don't think they talked about that story at home? You don't think that brought up questions about faith and God and circumstances? I mean, let's just pretend these are human beings because they're portrayed. I mean, they're having these experiences. Right? And now he's had this rivalry with his brother. Okay, and he's nervous about what that's going to be about going forward. He's looking for protection. He's looking for place. I just think it's honest. You know what? I'm a little concerned right now, God. So help me out here. Show me something. I just think that it's human. Back to that earlier thread.
It wasn't written for 20th, 21st century folk, but when you read these stories, if you've done any pastoral theology or family systems analysis, man, what a rich text this all is. You have the two brothers And you know, Jacob, the name means grasper. Somebody who's clutching, somebody who's reaching out. He's born holding on to his brother's heel. Don't name your son Grabby. If you want him to be pacific and easy to live with, don't burden your son with a name like that. But he then goes out and, again, with the help of his mother and God, achieves blessing, and enough blessing that he needs to leave home because his brother wants to kill him. That's how well he's done. And he goes over to the other side of the hills and begins family with members of his mother's family. And his scheming ways continue to succeed for him in the care of his uncle's flocks. And the uncle is part of the same scheming family tradition that Jacob is. He falls in love with one sister. There's a wonderful deal. You will work for me for 7 years, then you will have her. He goes to bed and wakes up the next morning with the other sister.
Which, by the way, is the opposite of what's happening to the sons in Genesis.
Yes, so the older sister is put in the place of the younger sister. And his uncle says, we don't do that in our country. It's like, well, you would think that maybe you would just say that on the front end rather than working that out. But, the flocks, he works out the deal with his uncle. The flocks that are darker will be his. Amazingly, that seems to be all the sheep that are born for the next several generations. So his flocks are numerous. And Laban's own sons, his cousins, say, this isn't working. We got to switch the deal around and have it be the sheep with no markings. And so that happens, and remarkably, all the next generations of sheep are light in color. And they just can't stand having this amount of success around it. So at this point, Jacob is wealthy. He's got 2 wives, a number of descendants, much property, many animals, and actually it's now safer for him to go back to the home that he fled. And so he goes on the way, and as he reaches the river Jabbok, I think this is among my favorite stories in all of Scripture. He anticipates a reunion with his brother, and so he sends out his property, his flocks and his servants and his children and his wives ahead of him, and each of them has a message for Esau, the brother whom he lied and cheated and stolen from, and that is, we are a gift from your younger brother. We are tribute to you. We're signs of his affection for you and of his gratitude for you and of how well he thinks of you. And each of them is there to make the same message, and there are waves of them. And Jacob sends them ahead to the other side of the river, Jabbok, and he stays on the other side. And it is so, it's clear, I think, to any straight reader of the text, that he anticipates that there is a risk to this proposition. And the risk is slaughter. And if Esau does to Jacob's people and property what Jacob knows he's really due, he will hear the sound of the slaughter, and he will make his exit stage right. Amazingly, Esau seems to have undergone a change and is glad and grateful and welcomes, doesn't want any of what's been offered to him, only wants the reunion with his brother, and says, you should move here. I've got some property right over there. You could settle there. And Jacob says, no, that's a wonderful offer. I think the other side of the hills might be better for me. And Esau says, don't go to the other side of the hills. They've got property right here. And he goes, no, I think that's very kind of you. I'm so appreciative. The other side of the hills, I think, would be safer for me. And what you realize is Jacob has undergone this incredible transformation. He's wrestled with God or the angel of God or a preacher or a human of some kind in the night. And in the morning, he's still Jacob. He's still trying to hedge his bets and still trying to make sure that he can survive and is unable to accept the acceptance of Esau. And it's also hard not to wonder whether that wasn't the right move anyway.
Well, you left out to me the more interesting part, which is the wrestling match. Because that night, Jacob wrestles in the dark with something. And depending on, it's read as an angel of God, it's read as God. Jack Miles says it's Esau. That he's come back to get his revenge on Jacob, and that's how the two of them worked out their relationship, by wrestling through the night.
To Jonathan's point about the kind of spiritual therapy that's happening here, whoever the text suggests he's wrestling with, it's clear to me that he's wrestling with his conscience over Esau. And he comes out of that experience injured. I'm sure everyone in this room has had an experience in their life where the worry and the doubt and the anxiety was such that you made yourself sick over it. And that you couldn't sleep well, and that you woke up suddenly with a pain or an ache or a concern, and which ultimately will go away, but which caused you this, was the result, the symptom of this great distress. This is an incredibly powerful spiritual moment for Jacob coming into his own, if you will. And St. John, you said he's still Jacob, he's not changed. From the Jewish lens, he's greatly changed because his name is changed. And suddenly his name goes from Jacob to Israel, which, to Bob, your question about who's he wrestling with, was translates in this text, because his name is changed twice in the story, but in this text, it means who wrestled with God. And then we all usually add and prevailed. In other words, you came through this spiritual conflict, you came to the other side, and suddenly now you are someone whole and different of spirit and able to respond to this. The other just kind of interesting thing, and then we'll pass the microphone on, is we're kind of conditioned to see Esau as a bad guy. And somehow Jacob is the innocent, nice guy. That's not what the text tells me. Jacob has his absolute character flaws for reasons that I think we've articulated. And while Esau is described as a hunter and hairy and out there and reddish and a little bit wild, those aren't bad traits. He's a hunter. He's making a living. He's following his path. And I have the text here when we read the story of their reunion. Let me read you just the text here, the English text. Esau ran to greet him, meaning Jacob. He embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. What a beautiful scene of reunion after all this anxiety and this worry and this concern. If you look with me here, Reinhard, Jonathan, David, maybe hard to see. If you look at the Hebrew word here, for which would be, and he kissed him. Okay, you see these dots above the Hebrew letters? Okay, in our Torah scroll, when we write this story out in the Hebrew text, we actually put these dots on top of the letters, because in medieval times, when rabbis read this text, they just couldn't accept it. So those dots say, yeah, it wasn't so sincere. Yeah, it wasn't so good. Yeah, Esau still, they can't accept the fact that Jacob himself had this spiritual experience where he's transformed. But I think that's the actual takeaway from the story.
Another aspect, while this is also one of my favorite texts, like Jonathan commented, is the ability throughout the scripture, throughout these families, that the characters that are portrayed have no compunction to argue with God, to wrestle with God, to have doubts, to bring their doubts to God, and are not rejected for that. Jacob wrestles with God, and he is somehow wounded by that, but there is a wrestling, a seeking to understand, and to me, this is also something of the Jewish community that I have come to greatly appreciate. It's not simply to find the truth. It is wrestling with God, seeking answers, not being happy with easy answers, and to argue with God and to understand. So it also, to me, this text is a bit of a reflection of the Jewish community, the chutzpah, that is very much part of the Jewish way of life, and I would say I have a little holy envy of that.
You want a vaccination for chutzpah?
As a vaccination?
I have a Jewish mother to start with.
Oh, yeah. No.
So the story goes. Yeah. Anybody else want to, before I start making a couple of announcements? I apologize to Misty. She asked me to announce the coffee is decaf, and I forgot to, so the coffee is decaf. And I would like to say to anyone who is watching us on live stream, if you want to be added to the email list, or if you have any comments or anything to say, my email address is there. So feel free. Now I'm going to look for questions. We should have a lot to talk about here, friends. Okay, where are we? Who wants in? I should pass it around. Is that a scratch or a play? No one? Oh, come on, stump the panel. Give us something. Okay.
Jonathan, you know I can't resist making trouble, right? So I would like to ask any of you who'd like to respond, what parallels or lessons or observations can you give us about these interfamilial and the brothers conflicts? Can you give us about conditions that we see in our world today? I mean, that's a really broad question, so just have fun with it.
Jonathan, you were mentioned. Have fun with it.
Well, I think it helps to normalize some of the distress and chaos that we experience in our own cultures and community. I don't think that it wants to bless them necessarily, but in times of strife and division, I think it can be encouraging to see that this has been a pattern with us before, that God is familiar with us as miscreants and misbehaviors and liars and cheaters and thieves, and did not give up on us then. So perhaps there is hope for us in this moment that is not based on how great we are, how wonderful and accomplished and self-effacing and pious, but in fact, despite much of what and who we are, that God won't let go.
That's what I wanted to say.
Just say ditto. Okay, any other questions? Yes, okay. Give them a toughie. I'll increase their salary.
for all of the misbehaviors that we see in the characters talked about tonight, when we look at our parallels, we are supposedly driven to be better. We have driving forces. We seek salvation. We seek repentance. We have even a motivation, perhaps, of a favorable afterlife as a driver towards behavior. Where is the afterlife or motivation in all of these characters we've talked about for betterness, for goodness? Where does that play in? I haven't heard that motivator breaking through tonight, other than a direct comment from God to do something, much of which isn't done. So,
my rabbi says this is not a Jewish question, and I would agree, because the concept of the afterlife is a rather late development in the Hebrew scriptures. But I would also like to ask the question back: if our motivation for doing good is because we want to get a ticket to heaven, is that really adequate as a foundation for morality, rather than to say it's the right thing to do, whether I get into heaven or whether I end up in hell? God tells me to do the right thing, and this is what we are called to do. To do good things for our purpose of getting into heaven seems, in some sense, a bit of a selfish motive, right? I use others for me to get a ticket to heaven. And to me, that may be a first stage of moral development, but I don't think it's hopefully the last and final stage, that we care about others because they're in distress, and that's what needs to be done. So, I cannot possibly speak for the Jewish community, but it's not a driver in Jewish theology, but it's a typical Christian question.
I get that, but what was driving the Jewish?
Okay.
So good. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Reinhard. So let me go to a very famous scene about Abraham that I think maybe we could use as a frame for answering that question. So we're all familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, and God uses, should I tell Abraham that I'm considering wiping these people out? First question you have to ask is, why should God take any interest in letting Abraham or any other human being know what God is thinking? But it's interesting that the text puts that right out there. Should I hide from Abraham my intention? Or indeed, do I owe him something? Why do I owe him something? Because I just made him the father of these peoples, and there is some kind of a responsibility I want him to take and have for the faith of humanity. So God, of course, tells him, I'm thinking of doing this. And you all know the famous story back. Abraham says, well, this is the second, you can't do that. What about 50 innocent people, 40 innocent, and he starts bargaining to look for the innocent people whom he cannot find. And finally, in his absolute frustration, Abraham actually shouts at God. And he says, Chalila lecha in Hebrew, which means shame on you. Shame on you, God. Shall not the judge of all the earth not do justice? You're holding me to a standard down here, God? What about you? And God relents. Unfortunately, Abraham can't find the righteous people. We know how the story ends. And Abraham then turns around at the very time when we want him to challenge God, because the next big episode is then take your son and lay him up as an offering on the mountain. And we're all reading the text and yelling at Abraham, shame on you, why are you doing this? You just challenged God about justice and you're not challenging back about this. And in the Jewish tradition, our midrash, our legends, our interpretations come in and say, let's assume and find how Abraham argued and fought. Let's find the place for justice in this story. And that's what the Jewish lens on these texts is. Where do we find the place for justice and goodness and rightness in the human community? Not what comes later, not what comes next. In Genesis, that's not yet something that's of theological or religious concern in the Jewish tradition. But what's right and just in the here and now, that's here the theme from our lens.
Well, I'm sorry to say that interfaith cookies are lost to COVID. There will be none, unfortunately, tonight. But thank you all for coming. I hope to see you January 18th, congregation near Tamim, where we will talk about rites of passage.